My ex-husband and his lawyer girlfriend took everything in the divorce. The farmhouse in Kentucky where I'd raised my children, the rental properties in Louisville, $2 million in assets, even my own babies turned against me. You lost, Dorothy, Vanessa said with a smile I'll never forget, her arm wrapped possessively around Edmund's waist. You have nothing left. And she was right. At 73 years old, I was broken, humiliated, and forgotten. But then I went to close my grandfather's old savings account, something I'd found tucked in a shoebox in my attic. I figured it had maybe $50 in it, if anything at all. The bank manager, a young woman named Claire, went completely pale when she checked the records. Ma'am, this account has been active in generating compound interest since 1947, she said, her hands shaking slightly as she typed. She swiveled the computer screen toward me, her eyes wide with something between shock and disbelief. What I saw on that screen left me absolutely speechless. My grandfather's $50 deposit had grown into something I couldn't even comprehend at first. But before I get to that moment, you need to understand who I was. You need to see everything I built, everything I loved, and everything they stole from me. Because only then will you understand why what I found in that bank wasn't just money. It was divine justice waiting 76 years to arrive. My name is Dorothy Mae Brennan, but everyone used to call me Dot. I'm 73 years old, and for 50 of those years, I built a life from absolutely nothing. I started out as a seamstress in a tiny Kentucky town called Millbrook, working in Mrs. Henderson's dress shop for $2 an hour. I wore hand-me-down clothes and shoes with cardboard covering the holes in the soles. My mama had died when I was 16, and my daddy, God rest his soul, drank himself to death 2 years later. I was alone in this world with nothing but a rusty Singer sewing machine my grandmother left me and a dream of something better. Every night I'd stay up past midnight, stitching wedding dresses and prom gowns for the wealthy families in town. That's where I met Edmund Brennan. He walked into Henderson's dress shop one spring morning in 1973, looking for someone to alter his mother's vintage wedding gown for his sister's upcoming wedding. He was 23, fresh out of business school, with dark hair and green eyes that made my heart skip. I was 22 and so naive I thought love conquered everything. Edmund seemed different from the other boys in Millbrook. He talked about opening his own accounting firm, about helping small businesses grow, about building something meaningful together. When he proposed 6 months later with a simple gold band he'd saved 3 months to buy, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. We got married in October 1973 at the Little Baptist Church on Maple Street. I wore a dress I'd sewn myself, cream-colored lace with pearl buttons I'd found at an estate sale. Edmund looked so handsome in his father's old suit, and when he said his vows, I believed every single word. We moved into a tiny apartment above Mr. Cooper's hardware store, just 2 rooms with a shared bathroom down the hall. But it was ours, and we were happy. I kept sewing at night while Edmund worked at Patterson Accounting during the day, learning the business from old man Patterson himself. We saved every penny, eating beans and rice most nights, dreaming of the day we'd own our own home. Our first baby, Lauren, came in 1975. I remember holding her in that cramped apartment, her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and thinking this was what heaven must feel like. Edmund was a good father then, gentle and patient, staying up with me during those endless nights of colic and teething. 2 years later came Michael, loud and boisterous from the moment he entered the world. Then in 1982, our surprise blessing, Jessica, who we called Jessie. 3 beautiful children, a modest house we'd finally bought on Sycamore Avenue, and Edmund's accounting practice finally turning a profit. I thought we'd made it. I thought nothing could ever touch us. But I was wrong, and by the time I realized how wrong, it was already too late. The woman who would destroy everything was already circling, and I never even saw her coming. I first met Vanessa Cole at the Millbrook County Fair in August 2019. Edmund had insisted we attend the business mixer tent, something he usually avoided like the plague. Networking opportunity, he'd said, straightening his tie in our bedroom mirror with unusual care. I'd noticed he'd been dressing better lately, buying new cologne, going to the gym at odd hours. At 70 years old, I'd chalked it up to a midlife crisis, maybe early retirement anxiety. He'd sold his accounting practice 6 months earlier, and we were supposed to be entering our golden years together. Instead, I was watching my husband's eyes light up when a woman in a crimson suit extended her perfectly manicured hand. "Edmund Brennan. I've heard so much about you from the business community," Vanessa purred, her grip lingering just a moment too long. She was maybe 50, with salon-perfect blonde hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. "I'm Vanessa Cole, just opened a law practice here in Millbrook. Specializing in family law and estate planning." She finally glanced at me, her smile not quite reaching her cold blue eyes. "And you must be the wife. Not Dorothy. Not Mrs. Brennan. Just the wife, like I was an accessory easily replaced." Edmund laughed too loud at something she said, his hand hovering near the small of her back as he guided her toward the refreshment table. I spent that evening watching them from across the tent, my stomach churning with an unease I couldn't name yet. Vanessa touched Edmund's arm when she laughed, leaned in close when she spoke, mirrored his body language in that calculated way predators do. Our daughter Lauren appeared at my elbow, following my gaze. "Dad seems to really like that lawyer lady," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Lauren was 44 then, a nurse practitioner with 2 teenagers of her own, and she'd inherited my intuition. "Mom, when's the last time Dad looked at you like that?" The question hit me like a slap because I couldn't remember. 5 years? 10? Somewhere between raising children and building a life, we'd become roommates instead of lovers. The next week, Edmund announced he needed legal advice about restructuring our estate. "Vanessa Cole specializes in this," he said over breakfast, not meeting my eyes. "She's offered to do a full assessment, make sure everything's protected for the kids." It seemed reasonable. We had the farmhouse, 3 rental properties we'd bought over the years, and about $2 million in savings and investments. At our age, estate planning made sense. I even felt grateful that Edmund was thinking ahead, being responsible. God, I was such a fool. I signed the papers giving Vanessa access to all our financial records, our property deeds, everything. I walked right into her trap, smiling, because my husband asked me to trust him. The estate planning meetings started happening twice a week. Edmund would come home late, smelling of expensive perfume, claiming they'd worked through dinner at her office. Our daughter Jessica, who lived just 20 minutes away, started calling less. Michael, our son in Arizona, stopped returning my calls altogether. Even Lauren became distant, making excuses when I invited her for Sunday dinner. Something was happening, something coordinated and deliberate, but I couldn't see the full picture yet. I felt like I was losing my mind, seeing connections that couldn't possibly be real. When I tried talking to Edmund about how isolated I felt, he'd sigh and say, "Dorothy, you're being paranoid. The kids are just busy with their own lives." Then came the afternoon that changed everything. I'd gone to Edmund's study looking for our insurance papers, my prescription coverage was about to expire, and I found his laptop open. The screen showed an email exchange between Edmund and Vanessa, and the preview was enough to make my blood run cold. "Can't wait to be rid of her, everything's almost in place, kids are on board, she'll never see it coming." My hands shook so badly I could barely click the email open. What I read in those messages wasn't just an affair. It was a conspiracy, months in planning, with my own children as accomplices. They were going to take everything, leave me with nothing, and they'd been laughing about it the whole time. In that moment, standing in my husband's study with tears streaming down my face, I realized I was about to lose everything I'd spent 50 years building. And the worst part? I had absolutely no idea how to stop them. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a smug process server who barely looked at me. I stood in my kitchen, the kitchen where I'd made 50 years of family meals, where I'd taught my children to bake, where I'd celebrated every holiday and milestone, and read words that destroyed my entire world. Petitioner alleges extreme emotional cruelty, financial manipulation, and systematic isolation of defendant from family members. I read that line 3 times before my brain could even process it. Edmund was accusing me of the exact things he'd been doing to me for months. It was gaslighting on a legal scale, and Vanessa Cole's signature sat at the bottom as his attorney of record. The allegations got worse with every page. Edmund claimed I'd hidden money from him, forged his signature on documents, turned his children against him through manipulation and lies. There were sworn statements from our neighbors, the Hendersons, saying they'd heard me screaming at Edmund through our windows. From our mailman claiming I'd intercepted Edmund's personal correspondence. From our former accountant, Gerald Wright, swearing I'd forced Edmund to transfer assets into my name through threats and coercion. Every single word was a complete fabrication, but they were documented, notarized, and filed with the court. I felt like I was reading about a monster, and that monster supposedly had my face. I called Lauren immediately, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. "Honey, please, you have to tell me what's happening. Your father is saying terrible things that aren't true." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought she'd hung up. Then her voice came through, cold and distant in a way I'd never heard from my baby girl. "Mom, we know everything. Dad showed us the bank records, the forged documents, everything. How could you steal from him? How could you manipulate all of us for years?" I tried to speak, to defend myself, but she cut me off. "Don't call me again until you're ready to admit what you've done." I hired the only lawyer I could afford on short notice, a tired public defender named Stanley Marcus who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. We met in his cramped office above a pawn shop, surrounded by stacks of case files and the smell of stale coffee. "Mrs. Brennan, I'll be honest with you," Stan said, flipping through the divorce petition with growing unease. "Vanessa Cole is one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in Kentucky. She doesn't take cases unless she knows she can win big. The evidence she's compiled here is extensive." He showed me bank statements I'd never seen, signatures that looked like mine but weren't, emails from an account I didn't recognize. "They've been building this case for at least a year." The preliminary hearing was set for November 15th. Stan explained that in Kentucky, judges had enormous discretion in asset division, especially when allegations of financial abuse were involved. If they can prove you manipulated him, controlled the finances, isolated him from family, even if it's all fabricated, you could lose everything. I sat in his office, a 73-year-old woman who'd never even gotten a speeding ticket, and realized I was facing complete destruction. Everything I'd worked for, saved for, built with my own hands over 5 decades would be gone. And my children, my precious babies who I'd sacrificed everything for, believed I was the villain in this story. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Vanessa Cole in her red suit, the way she'd looked at Edmund at that county fair, the calculated precision of her smile. This wasn't just about an affair. Affairs were messy, emotional, impulsive. This was systematic destruction, planned and executed like a military operation. Vanessa had identified a target, an elderly man with assets and manipulable adult children, and she'd moved in like a predator. Edmund was just weak enough, just vain enough, just dissatisfied enough with our quiet life to fall for it. And I, trusting and naive after 47 years of marriage, had never stood a chance against someone like her. The scariest part was knowing the hearing was just 3 weeks away, and I had absolutely no defense prepared. Stan had warned me that without evidence disproving their claims, without witnesses willing to testify on my behalf, I was walking into a slaughter. "You need to prepare yourself for the possibility of losing everything," he'd said, not unkindly. "The house, the rental properties, the savings, all of it could go to Edmund." At your age, with no independent income, you'd be looking at whatever modest spousal support the judge decides you deserve. I'd asked him what that might look like. His answer made me want to vomit, maybe $1,500 a month. After 50 years of marriage and building a $2 million estate together, I'd be left with barely enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment. And Edmund and Vanessa would live in my farmhouse, sleep in my bed, probably laugh about how easy it had been to destroy stupid, trusting Dorothy. That thought kept me up all night, rage and despair fighting for dominance in my chest. I had 3 weeks to find a miracle, and I had absolutely no idea where to even start looking. Judge Patricia Morrison entered the courtroom like a queen ascending her throne, black robes flowing behind her, steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. I'd heard she was tough but fair, a 30-year veteran of family court who'd seen every dirty trick in the book. What I didn't know, what Stan would discover too late, was that Judge Morrison had attended the same country club as Vanessa Cole for years. They played tennis together. Their daughters went to the same private school. The fix was in before I even sat down at the defendant's table, and I was too naive to see it coming. Stan whispered, "Stay calm, answer questions honestly, and for God's sake, don't let them see you cry." Vanessa Cole stood to present her opening statement, and I watched a master manipulator at work. She painted a picture of poor, victimized Edmund Brennan, a successful businessman who'd spent 47 years under the thumb of a controlling, emotionally abusive wife. Dorothy Brennan systematically isolated Mr. Brennan from his children, controlled every aspect of their finances, and created an environment of fear and manipulation, Vanessa declared, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. She forged his signature on multiple property transfers, hiding assets she'd moved into her name only. She turned his children against him through years of poisonous lies. Today, we ask this court to protect Mr. Brennan from further abuse and restore what is rightfully his. The first witness was our neighbor, Patricia Henderson, a woman I'd known for 30 years. We'd shared recipes, watched each other's kids, celebrated birthdays together. Now she sat in the witness box, refusing to meet my eyes, and described hearing constant screaming from our house. Dorothy would berate Edmund terribly, Patricia testified, her hands folded primly in her lap. I heard her call him worthless, stupid, a failure. It was heartbreaking. I wanted to scream that this was a lie, that Edmund and I barely fought at all, that Patricia was somehow being paid or coerced. But Stan's hand on my arm kept me silent as he scribbled notes furiously. Next came Gerald Wright, our accountant of 20 years. Gerald testified that I'd pressured Edmund into transferring the rental properties into my name, threatening divorce if he didn't comply. Mrs. Brennan told me explicitly that she wanted full control of the assets, Gerald said, adjusting his glasses nervously. She said if Edmund ever tried to leave her, she'd make sure he got nothing. I felt like I was watching someone else's trial, some alternate reality where I was a completely different person. Stan's cross-examination was weak, almost apologetic, as Gerald stuck to his story. Later I'd learned Vanessa had paid Gerald $50,000 for his testimony, but in that moment, I just looked guilty and desperate. Then they called my children. Lauren took the stand first, and my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. My baby girl, who I'd rocked through nightmares and cheered at soccer games, who I'd helped through her divorce and supported through nursing school, looked at me with absolute contempt. My mother has always been manipulative, Lauren testified, her voice steady and cold. She pit us against our father, made us think he was the problem when really she was controlling everything. I didn't realize it until Dad finally got the courage to leave her. Vanessa asked if Lauren had seen evidence of my financial manipulation. Yes, Lauren said without hesitation. She hid bank statements, intercepted Dad's mail, even forged his signature on documents. I saw it with my own eyes. Michael and Jessica corroborated every word. Michael, calling in via video from Arizona, described me as emotionally unstable and increasingly paranoid in recent years. Jessica, sweet Jessie, who I'd thought was closest to me, testified that I'd tried to turn her against her father by making false accusations about an affair. Mom claimed Dad was seeing his lawyer, which was a complete fabrication she created to justify her controlling behavior, Jessica said, her voice quavering slightly. I realized then that Vanessa had gotten to them months ago, probably promising them larger inheritances if they cooperated, feeding them carefully constructed lies mixed with just enough truth to make them believable. My own children had been weaponized against me, and I'd never seen it happening. When it was finally my turn to testify, I was already defeated. I took the stand with trembling legs, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth while surrounded by liars. Vanessa's cross-examination was brutal and surgical. She had copies of bank statements showing transfers I'd never made. Emails from accounts I'd never opened. Signatures that looked exactly like mine but couldn't have been because I'd been in church or at Lauren's house on those dates. Every piece of evidence had been meticulously forged, and I sounded insane trying to claim it was all fake. Mrs. Brennan, are you suggesting that your husband, your children, your neighbors, and your accountant are all lying? Vanessa asked, her tone suggesting I was delusional. Yes, I whispered, knowing how crazy it sounded. They're all lying. Judge Morrison's expression told me everything I needed to know. She saw a bitter, delusional old woman trying to hold on to assets and relevance, fighting against a family that had finally found the courage to speak truth. When court adjourned for the day, Stan pulled me aside with the worst news yet. They're going to win, Dorothy. I'm sorry, but without concrete evidence proving their documents are forged, without witnesses willing to contradict their testimony, you're going to lose everything. We need to start talking about damage control, maybe negotiating a settlement for minimal spousal support. I walked out of that courthouse into the cold November air, and for the first time in my 73 years, I understood what it meant to be completely, utterly, devastatingly alone. The hearing would resume in 2 days for final arguments and judgment. I had 48 hours to accept that my life as I knew it was over, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it. The courtroom felt suffocating when Judge Morrison delivered her ruling. I sat next to Stan, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone white, and listened to a stranger describe my life in terms that made me sound like a monster. After reviewing the extensive evidence presented and hearing testimony from multiple credible witnesses, Judge Morrison began, her reading glasses perched on her nose. This court finds that Dorothy Mae Brennan engaged in systematic financial manipulation and emotional abuse throughout the marriage. The evidence of forged documents, hidden assets, and isolation tactics is overwhelming and deeply concerning. Each word felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Therefore, this court awards the primary marital residence located at 4782 Sycamore Avenue, along with all furnishings and personal property contained therein, to Edmund James Brennan. Additionally, the 3 rental properties located in Louisville shall be transferred solely to Mr. Brennan's name, as they would have been originally had Mrs. Brennan not engaged in fraudulent transfer of assets. Judge Morrison continued reading without emotion, stripping away 50 years of my life piece by piece. The joint savings and investment accounts, totaling approximately $2 million, shall be divided as follows: 90% to Mr. Brennan, 10% to Mrs. Brennan, given her culpability in the financial manipulation that necessitated this divorce. I did the math in my head through a fog of disbelief. 10% of $2 million was $200,000. After 47 years of marriage, after building everything together from nothing, I was being given $200,000 and told to disappear. Mrs. Brennan will vacate the marital home within 30 days, Judge Morrison continued. Restraining orders will be issued preventing any contact with Mr. Brennan or attempts to manipulate the adult children. Given Mrs. Brennan's age and limited employment prospects, the court awards spousal support in the amount of $1,200 per month, reviewable in 5 years. $1,200. I couldn't even rent a decent apartment in Millbrook for $1,200. Vanessa Cole was smiling. Edmund wouldn't look at me. My children sat in the gallery behind Edmund, and when I turned to look at them, hoping for some sign of regret or doubt, they stared back with cold satisfaction. Lauren actually nodded, like justice had been served. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to demand they all look at what they'd done to me. Instead I sat frozen, tears streaming silently down my face, while Judge Morrison signed the orders that destroyed my entire existence. "This court is adjourned," she said, her gavel falling with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. In the hallway outside the courtroom, I watched Edmund and Vanessa embrace, her head on his shoulder, his hand stroking her hair. They'd won, and they weren't even trying to hide their triumph. Stan touched my elbow gently. "Dorothy, I'm so sorry. We can appeal, but honestly, Judge Morrison's ruling is pretty airtight. Without new evidence, we'd be wasting money you don't have." I nodded numbly, unable to form words. My daughter Jessica walked past without acknowledging me. Michael had already left. Only Lauren paused, and for just a second, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Guilt? Regret? But then it was gone, and she walked away to join her father and his new woman. I drove back to my farmhouse, soon to be Edmund's farmhouse, in a daze. The November landscape blurred past my windows, bare trees against gray sky, the world stripped of color just like my life had been stripped of meaning. I'd been married for 47 years. I'd raised 3 children. I'd built a home, a family, a life of simple happiness and quiet dignity. And in less than 4 months, it had all been systematically dismantled by a predatory lawyer and my weak, vain husband. The cruelest part wasn't losing the money or the property. It was losing my children's love and respect, watching them choose lies over their own mother. I pulled into the driveway of 4782, Sycamore Avenue for what would be one of my last times. The house I'd scrubbed and painted and filled with love for 5 decades suddenly looked like a stranger's home, somewhere I no longer belonged. I had 30 days to pack up 50 years of memories, find somewhere to live on $200,000 that had to last the rest of my life, and accept that I'd never hug my grandchildren again. I sat in my car in the driveway until the sun set and the November cold seeped through the windows. Then I went inside, climbed the stairs to my bedroom, and lay down on the bed where I'd slept beside Edmund for 47 years. And finally, alone in the darkness, I let myself completely fall apart. Belle, if you're still watching, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know which city you're listening from. Your support means everything to me, and it helps me bring you more stories like Dorothy's. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next will absolutely shock you. Dorothy's story is far from over, and the discovery she's about to make will change everything. The next 3 weeks were a blur of packing boxes and giving away a lifetime. I'd found a tiny 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the poor side of Millbrook for $100 a month, the only place I could afford while stretching my $200,000 to last potentially 20 more years. The apartment had stained carpet, a kitchenette with appliances from the 70s, and a bathroom where the tiles had cracked and never been replaced. Standing in that empty space with my suitcases, I realized this was my future, alone, forgotten, poor despite working my entire life. The woman in the mirror looked hollow, her gray hair unwashed, her eyes sunken and defeated. I barely recognized myself anymore. The humiliation of moving out was worse than I'd imagined. Edmund had actually shown up with Vanessa on moving day, the two of them walking through the farmhouse like prospective buyers, discussing what furniture they'd keep and what they'd replace. "This couch is so dated, honey," Vanessa said, running her hand along the back of the sofa where I'd nursed 3 babies and read thousands of bedtime stories. "Let's get rid of everything except maybe the dining set." Edmund agreed immediately, erasing me from the house as easily as painting over old wallpaper. They didn't even have the decency to wait until I'd finished loading my truck. I walked past them carrying a box of photo albums, and Vanessa actually smirked. My children never called. Not once during those 3 weeks did Lauren, Michael, or Jessica reach out to see if I needed help moving, if I was okay, if I had somewhere to go. I'd text them my new address and phone number, hoping against hope that someone would respond. Nothing. Radio silence. I'd lost my husband, my home, my money, and now my children had been stolen too. At night in my new apartment, I'd lie on the second-hand mattress I'd bought at Goodwill and think about how easy it would be to just give up, to stop fighting a world that had decided I was worthless. Those were dark thoughts, the kind that scared me because they felt so seductive. I got a part-time job at the Millbrook Public Library, shelving books and checking materials out for $8 an hour. It was humiliating at 73 to be starting over at minimum wage, but I needed something to fill the endless empty days. My coworkers were kind but distant, treating me like the elderly woman I'd suddenly become rather than the vibrant person I used to be. During lunch breaks I'd sit in the staff room alone, eating peanut butter sandwiches and avoiding the local newspaper that sometimes featured pictures of Edmund and Vanessa at charity events, living my life with my money in my house. The injustice of it all burned like acid in my chest. Then came the afternoon I ran into them at the Piggly Wiggly. I was buying the cheapest groceries I could find, store-brand everything, day-old bread, bruised produce from the discount bin, when I turned my cart down the cereal aisle and came face to face with Edmund and Vanessa. They were laughing about something, Vanessa in a designer outfit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, Edmund in expensive casual clothes I'd never seen before. The cart Vanessa pushed was full of premium brands, fresh flowers, steaks, wine. Everything I used to buy when it was my money paying for it. They saw me, and their laughter stopped abruptly. Vanessa's smile turned sharp and cruel. "Dorothy," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "How are you managing?" She looked pointedly at my cart with its generic cereal and dented cans, at my worn coat and practical shoes. Edmund wouldn't meet my eyes, but I saw his mouth twitch in something that might have been satisfaction. This was what he'd wanted, to see me brought low, to prove he'd won completely. I wanted to say something cutting, something dignified that would show them they hadn't broken me. Instead I heard my voice crack as I said, "I'm fine," and pushed my cart past them as quickly as possible. Behind me I heard Vanessa laugh, not even bothering to lower her voice. "She looks awful, honey. Like she's aged 10 years. I abandoned my half-full cart in the frozen food section and walked out of that grocery store, got in my 15-year-old Honda, and drove aimlessly through Millbrook with tears streaming down my face. I ended up at the cemetery where my parents and grandparents were buried, needing to be near someone who'd actually loved me once. I sat on the cold ground next to my grandfather's headstone, the November wind cutting through my thin coat, and I prayed for the first time in months. Not for revenge or justice, but just for the strength to survive one more day. "Grandpa Joseph," I whispered to the granite marker, "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to keep going when everything is gone." The wind picked up, scattering dead leaves across the cemetery, and I wondered if giving up would really be so wrong. That night, back in my depressing apartment with the laundromat humming through the floorboards, I started going through the last boxes I'd packed from the farmhouse. I'd thrown together random items in my haste to leave, old photos, my mother's recipe cards, meaningless knickknacks from a life that no longer existed. At the bottom of one box, wrapped in a moth-eaten towel, I found something I'd completely forgotten about. It was an old metal strongbox, maybe 8 inches across, locked with a combination I'd never known. I recognized it immediately as belonging to my grandfather Joseph, who died when I was 17. He'd been a simple farmer, never had much money, but he'd kept this box hidden in his bedroom closet like it contained precious treasure. After he died, my father had shoved it in the attic, saying he'd deal with it later. He never did, and eventually I'd inherited it along with other forgotten family items. I turned the box over in my hands, curiosity momentarily overriding my despair. What had my grandfather thought was valuable enough to lock away? And maybe, just maybe, there was something inside that could help me figure out what to do next. I had no idea that this battered metal box held not just my salvation, but divine justice that had been waiting 76 years for exactly this moment. I spent that entire evening trying to open my grandfather's strongbox. I tried prying it with a butter knife, hitting it with a hammer, even taking it to the building superintendent, who just shrugged and suggested a locksmith I couldn't afford. Finally, frustrated and exhausted, I threw it against my kitchenette counter. The old lock, weakened by 76 years of rust, popped open with a metallic snap that made me jump. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1947, was a stack of papers tied with string and a single small booklet with First National Bank of Kentucky embossed on the cover. My hands trembled as I carefully untied the string and opened the booklet. It was a savings account passbook, the old-fashioned kind they don't even use anymore. The first entry was dated March 15, 1947, in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Initial deposit, $50. I remembered my grandmother telling me that $50 in 1947 was nearly a month's wages for a farmhand. This would have been a huge sacrifice for my grandfather, a massive amount to put away. Subsequent entries showed small deposits, $5 here, $10 there, all in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The last entry was dated December 1956, showing a balance of $375.62. Then nothing. No more deposits, no withdrawals, just blank pages for the next 69 years. My grandfather had died in 1966, and apparently everyone had forgotten about this account, assuming it had closed automatically or been absorbed by the bank years ago. But folded inside the passbook's back cover was a letter, written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting on a single sheet of paper. To whoever finds this, it began, I have kept this account secret from everyone, including your grandmother, as an emergency fund for my descendants. If you are reading this, you have fallen on hard times and need help. This money was earned with honest work and saved through sacrifice. Use it wisely, not for revenge, but to rebuild what has been taken from you. Remember that the measure of a person is not what they have, but what they do when everything is lost. God bless you. Joseph Brennan. The date at the bottom was January 1966, just 2 months before he died of a heart attack in his barn. He'd known something was coming, had wanted to leave this for his family. The next morning, I took the passbook to the First National Bank of Kentucky downtown, expecting to be told the account had been closed decades ago. The young teller, a girl named Madison who couldn't have been more than 25, looked at the booklet with confusion. "Ma'am, I've never seen one of these before. Let me get my manager." She disappeared into the back office, and I stood at the counter feeling foolish, probably chasing a ghost from 76 years ago. But when the manager emerged, a middle-aged woman named Claire Patterson, her face had gone pale. "Mrs. Brennan, would you please come with me to my office?" She ushered me into a private room with urgent efficiency, closing the door behind us. Claire sat down at her computer and typed rapidly, her expression growing more shocked with each keystroke. "Ma'am, this account is still active. It's been generating compound interest since 1947 without a single withdrawal." She paused, her hands hovering over the keyboard. "Mrs. Brennan, your grandfather's $50 deposit, with compound interest at an average of 6.5% annually over 76 years. She turned the monitor toward me. The number on the screen didn't make sense at first. My brain couldn't process that many digits. I read it 3 times before I understood what I was seeing. The account balance showed $3,478,912.18. $3.4 million had been sitting in this forgotten account while I'd lost everything, while I'd been eating discount bread and working for $8 an hour, while Edmund and Vanessa celebrated their victory over me. I couldn't breathe. The office spun around me, and Claire had to grab my arm to steady me in my chair. "Mrs. Brennan, are you all right? Should I call someone?" I shook my head, unable to form words, staring at that number like it might disappear if I looked away. $3.4 million. More than Edmund and Vanessa had stolen from me. More than I'd ever had in my entire life. My grandfather's $50 sacrifice, compounded over 7 decades, had grown into a fortune that defied comprehension. And he'd left it specifically for someone in his family who'd fallen on hard times, who needed help rebuilding. He'd left it for me, 76 years before I'd need it, like he'd somehow known. "I need to verify your identity before we can proceed," Claire said gently, pulling out forms with shaking hands. I provided my driver's license, birth certificate, documentation proving my lineage to Joseph Brennan. The bank's legal team had to get involved, confirming the account's authenticity, researching the chain of inheritance. It took 3 hours, but finally Claire handed me a temporary debit card and a receipt showing the full balance. "Mrs. Brennan, I have to say, in 20 years of banking, I've never seen anything like this. Your grandfather must have been an extraordinary man." I clutched that receipt like a lifeline, tears streaming down my face, and thought about Grandpa Joseph's letter. He hadn't wanted me to use this for revenge. He'd wanted me to rebuild. But as I walked out of that bank into the cold December air, I realized that sometimes rebuilding and justice were the same thing. I didn't tell anyone about the account. Not my children, not Edmund, certainly not Vanessa. I went back to my apartment above the laundromat, sat on my second-hand mattress, and pulled out the letter from my grandfather again. "Use it wisely, not for revenge, but to rebuild what has been taken from you." I thought about that phrase for hours. What had been taken from me wasn't just money or property. It was my dignity, my reputation, my family, my truth. Vanessa Cole had built a case against me using lies, forgery, and manipulation. She'd turned my children against me, stolen my husband, and destroyed my name in our community. And she'd done it all legally, hiding behind the system she'd mastered. If I wanted to rebuild, I needed to tear down the foundation of lies she'd constructed. That wasn't revenge. That was justice. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Thornton and Associates, the most prestigious law firm in Louisville, 3 hours from Millbrook. I asked to speak with their senior partner about a complex fraud and legal malpractice case. When the receptionist tried to schedule me weeks out, I said 4 words that changed everything: money is no object. I had an appointment for the next day. The second call was to Blackwood Investigations, a private investigation firm that specialized in legal fraud. I'd found them online, read about cases where they'd uncovered forgery rings and corrupt attorneys. I hired them on the spot, gave them everything I had: the divorce papers, the forged documents, the names of witnesses who'd lied under oath. "Find out how she did it," I told the lead investigator, a retired FBI agent named Marcus Webb. "Find out how Vanessa Cole built her lies, and get me proof." I didn't go to work at the library that day. Instead, I sat in my apartment and made a list of everything I knew, everything I suspected, every inconsistency in the case against me. The bank statements showing transfers I'd never made, how had Vanessa forged those? The emails from accounts I didn't recognize, who'd created them? The neighbors, the accountant, my own children who'd testified against me, had they been paid, threatened, or just manipulated? Somewhere in this web of lies was a thread that, if pulled correctly, would unravel everything. And now I had the resources to pull that thread as hard and as long as necessary. Vanessa Cole had destroyed me because she thought I was powerless, old, and broken. She'd made one fatal mistake. She'd underestimated just how much an angry, desperate grandmother with $3 million could accomplish when she had nothing left to lose. My meeting with Robert Kingsley at Thornton and Associates changed everything. Robert was 68, a silver-haired attorney who'd spent 40 years specializing in legal malpractice and fraud cases. When I told him my story, laying out every document, every forged signature, every coached testimony, he leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. "Mrs. Brennan, what Vanessa Cole did to you is not just unethical. If we can prove it, it's criminal. Attorney misconduct, fraud, conspiracy, possibly even racketeering if she's done this to others. His eyes gleamed with intensity. And I suspect she has. Robert's retainer was $50,000, which I paid without hesitation. He assembled a team, 2 junior attorneys, a forensic accountant, and a document specialist who'd testified in federal fraud cases. We're going to take this slow and methodical, Robert explained. Vanessa Cole is smart, connected, and ruthless. She'll have covered her tracks carefully. But fraud always leaves fingerprints. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb from Blackwood Investigations was already digging into Vanessa's background, her previous cases, her financial records. I moved out of my apartment above the laundromat and into a modest but comfortable house in a Louisville suburb. Every morning I'd drive to Robert's office and work with his team, going through every document from my divorce case. The forensic accountant, Dr. Sarah Chin, discovered the first crack in Vanessa's armor. The bank statements showing my alleged fraudulent transfers had been created using software that didn't exist until 2021, but the transfers were supposedly made in 2019. Someone forged these recently and backdated them, Sarah explained. This is prosecutable fraud. The document specialist, Bernard Moss, examined the signatures Vanessa claimed were mine. Using microscopic analysis and computer modeling, he proved that while they looked similar to my handwriting, they'd been created using a signature stamp or digital forgery tool. The pressure patterns are wrong, the ink distribution is too uniform, and there are identical microvariations across multiple documents, Bernard explained. No human hand writes with this kind of mechanical precision. These signatures were manufactured, probably from a sample Mrs. Cole obtained during the estate planning process, then duplicated and placed on fraudulent documents. But the biggest breakthrough came from Marcus Webb's investigation. He called me on a Friday evening in late January, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "Dorothy, you need to come to my office right now. I found something you need to see." I drove through freezing rain to his downtown Louisville office. Marcus had his conference room set up like a war room, photographs pinned to boards, timelines drawn on white boards, stacks of documents organized by color-coded tabs. "Vanessa Cole has been running this scam for at least 8 years, he said. I've identified 11 other cases following the exact same pattern. Marcus showed me files on 11 men, ranging in age from 58 to 76, all wealthy, all divorced by wives who'd hired Vanessa Cole as their attorney. In every case, the husband lost significantly more than the standard 50-50 split. In every case, Vanessa ended up in a relationship with the ex-husband within months of the divorce finalization. It's a con, Marcus explained. Vanessa identifies wealthy married men through her country club or social connections. She befriends the wife, offers to help with estate planning or legal issues. During that process, she gains access to all their financial information. Then she seduces the husband, convinces him to divorce his wife, and orchestrates the legal destruction of the spouse while keeping the assets accessible to her new boyfriend. I stared at the photographs of 11 women who'd suffered exactly what I had. One had committed suicide 6 months after her divorce, leaving a note saying she couldn't live with the lies told about her. What happened to them? I whispered. Marcus's expression was grim. Most ended up destitute, isolated from their families. A few fought back but couldn't afford the kind of legal team needed to prove fraud. You're the first one with enough money and evidence to actually take her down. Robert Kingsley reviewed Marcus's findings and smiled for the first time since I'd met him. This is exactly what we needed. With this pattern established, we can prove systematic fraud and possibly RICO charges. Over the next month, Robert's team compiled a case that was ironclad. We tracked down 3 of Vanessa's previous victims who were willing to testify, women who'd lost everything and wanted justice as badly as I did. But I wanted one more thing before we moved forward. I wanted my children to know the truth. In early February, I hired another private investigator to document Edmund and Vanessa's activities. Within 2 weeks, we had photographs of them at restaurants I'd loved, photographs of Vanessa wearing my mother's jewelry, photographs of them meeting with Gerald Wright, our accountant who'd testified against me, and paying him cash in a parking garage. The investigator even got audio of Vanessa laughing about stupid Dorothy and how easy I'd been to manipulate. I sent packets to all 3 of my children containing copies of the evidence, transcripts of Vanessa's conversations, proof of the forged documents, and a letter explaining everything. "I don't expect you to believe me immediately," I wrote. "But I need you to look at this evidence with clear eyes. Ask yourselves if the mother who raised you could really be the person they claimed I was." 3 days later, my phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was Lauren, crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Mom," she sobbed, "oh my God, Mom, what did we do? What did we do to you?" They'd looked at the evidence together and finally seen the truth. "We destroyed you," Lauren wept. "We testified against you in court, we abandoned you, we believed every lie she told. Mom, I'm so sorry." The next day, all 3 of my children drove to my Louisville house. The reunion was painful and beautiful and complicated. They'd brought my grandchildren I hadn't seen in months, and when my granddaughter Emma hugged me and whispered, "I missed you, Grandma," I thought my heart would burst. "Mom," Michael said as they were preparing to leave, "what are you going to do?" I looked at my son and saw in his eyes that he already knew the answer. "I'm going to destroy her," I said quietly. "Not for revenge, but for justice. For me, for the 11 other women she's done this to, and for every future victim she'd claim if someone doesn't stop her." Robert Kingsley arranged a meeting with the Kentucky District Attorney's Office in late February. We walked into that conference room with 3 bankers' boxes full of evidence, and by the time we finished our presentation, the prosecutors looked like they'd just been handed Christmas. "This is the most comprehensive fraud case I've seen in 15 years, said Assistant District Attorney Monica Reeves, a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in white-collar crime. "If even half of this holds up, Vanessa Cole is looking at serious prison time. And Edmund Brennan as an accomplice." She looked at me with something like awe. "Mrs. Brennan, how did you compile all of this?" I thought about my grandfather's account, the $3 million that had bought justice. "I had help," I said simply. The DA's office moved with surprising speed once they understood the scope of Vanessa's operation. They subpoenaed her financial records, her client files, her email accounts. They interviewed Gerald Wright, our accountant, who folded like a cheap suit when faced with potential conspiracy charges. He admitted Vanessa had paid him $75,000 to testify falsely, that she'd coached him on exactly what to say, and that he knew of at least 3 other witnesses she'd paid in my case alone. Patricia Henderson, our neighbor who testified about hearing me scream at Edmund, cracked under interrogation and admitted Vanessa had given her $10,000 and promised to help with her daughter's legal troubles if she cooperated. One by one, the foundation of lies crumbled. But Robert wanted more than just criminal charges. "We're going to file a civil suit simultaneously," he explained, his team working around the clock. "We're suing Vanessa for fraud, Edmund for conspiracy and fraud, and we're petitioning to have your entire divorce annulled and retried. Every asset they took from you will be returned, plus damages, plus legal fees. By the time we're done, they'll wish they'd never heard your name." The civil suit we filed in early March was 93 pages long, detailing every fraudulent act, every forged document, every coached witness, every manipulation. It named not just Vanessa and Edmund, but also Gerald Wright, Patricia Henderson, and Judge Patricia Morrison for potential judicial misconduct given her undisclosed relationship with Vanessa. The arrest warrants were issued on March 15, 2024, exactly 77 years to the day after my grandfather opened his savings account. Robert said it was coincidence, but I believed in divine timing. The DA's office coordinated with local law enforcement for maximum impact. Vanessa and Edmund were at the Millbrook Country Club, attending some charity gala in the same ballroom where I'd once been honored for my community service. They were holding court, Edmund in a tuxedo I'd never seen, Vanessa in a dress that probably cost more than my first car. Surrounded by friends and admirers, glasses of champagne raised in toast, they never saw it coming. Marcus Webb had an investigator at the gala, filming everything. I watched the video later, and I'll admit I watched it more than once. 6 police officers entered the ballroom at 8:30 p.m. The music stopped. Conversations died. And every eye in that room turned to watch as Detective Sarah Martinez approached Vanessa and Edmund's table. "Vanessa Cole, Edmund Brennan, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of documents, perjury, and legal malpractice." The detective's voice carried in the silent room. Vanessa's face went white, then red, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Edmund stood so fast he knocked over his chair, looking wildly for an escape that didn't exist. "This is ridiculous," Vanessa sputtered as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "I'm an attorney." "You can't just, we have warrants, Ms. Cole," Detective Martinez said calmly. "And about 200 pages of evidence that says we absolutely can." They were led out of that ballroom in handcuffs, past shocked friends and horrified socialites, past the same people who'd shunned me when Vanessa's lies were accepted as truth. Someone must have called the local news, because cameras were waiting outside. The footage of Vanessa and Edmund's perp walk made the 6 o'clock news and went viral on social media. Within hours, #VanessaColeExposed was trending, and people were sharing stories of other lawyers suspected of similar schemes. I didn't attend the arraignment. Robert advised me to maintain distance until the trials, but he called me afterward with the details. Bail was set at $500,000 each. Vanessa made bail immediately through some high-powered attorney she called from Boston. Edmund's still in jail because he apparently can't access the liquid assets. Your rental properties and house are tied up in the civil suit, and his accounts have been frozen pending investigation. There was satisfaction in Robert's voice. "The man spent months gloating about taking everything from you, and now he's sitting in county jail because he can't scrape together bail money." Irony at its finest. The criminal trial was set for July, but the civil case moved faster. In late April, Judge Thomas Whitmore, brought in from out of county to avoid any conflict of interest, heard our motion to annul the divorce and return all assets. Vanessa's new attorney, a slick Boston lawyer named Richard Thornburg, tried every trick to get the case dismissed, but the evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents, the paid witnesses, Gerald Wright's confession, Patricia Henderson's admission, it all painted a picture of systematic fraud that even Thornburg couldn't spin. "This divorce was obtained through criminal fraud and legal malpractice," Robert argued, standing before Judge Whitmore with quiet authority. "Everything that followed from it is therefore void. Mrs. Brennan's assets must be returned, her reputation restored, and damages paid for the suffering inflicted." Judge Whitmore took 2 weeks to review everything, and when he issued his ruling, it was scathing. "In 32 years on the bench, I have never seen such a calculated, cruel, and comprehensive fraud perpetrated against a vulnerable litigant," he wrote in his 40-page decision. "The actions of Ms. Cole and Mr. Brennan represent not just legal malpractice, but a coordinated criminal conspiracy to deprive Mrs. Brennan of her assets, her family, and her dignity. This court finds that the divorce granted by Judge Morrison was procured through fraud and is hereby annulled. All assets are to be returned to Mrs. Brennan within 30 days. Additionally, defendants are jointly liable for $2 million in damages for emotional distress, loss of reputation, and punitive damages designed to deter similar conduct." I sat in Robert's office when he read me the decision over the phone, and I cried. Not delicate tears, but huge, gulping sobs that came from somewhere deep in my soul. Everything they'd taken was coming back. The farmhouse on Sycamore Avenue, the rental properties, the $2 million, plus another $2 million in damages. But more than that, my name was cleared. The court had officially declared that I'd been the victim of fraud, that every terrible thing said about me was a lie. "We're not done yet," Robert reminded me gently. "The criminal trial is still coming, and that's where Vanessa and Edmund will really pay." "But Dorothy, you've won. Justice has been served." That night, I drove back to Millbrook for the first time in months. I parked across the street from my farmhouse, still legally Edmund's for another 29 days, and looked at the lit windows. I could see shapes moving inside, Edmund and Vanessa's life built on stolen ground. In less than a month, they'd have to leave. Edmund would be ordered to vacate the home he'd stolen, and Vanessa would be facing years in prison. I should have felt triumphant, victorious, drunk on revenge. Instead, I felt tired and sad, mourning the 47 years I'd wasted on a man weak enough to betray everything for a pretty face and empty promises. But I also felt strong. I'd been knocked down as far as a person can go, and I'd gotten back up. I'd fought back. And I'd won. Not because I was smarter or tougher or better, but because I'd refused to give up when everyone expected me to disappear quietly. My grandfather's letter had been right. The measure of a person is what they do when everything is lost. And I'd measured up just fine. The criminal trial began on July 8, 2024, and lasted 3 weeks. I sat in that courtroom every single day, watching Vanessa Cole's mask crack piece by piece. The prosecution presented our evidence methodically: the forged documents, the paid witnesses, Gerald Wright's testimony about the conspiracy, financial records showing Vanessa had run the scam on 11 other women over 8 years. They brought in handwriting experts, forensic accountants, even a psychologist who testified about sophisticated manipulation tactics used by con artists. Edmund testified against Vanessa, trying to save himself by claiming he'd been manipulated too. It was pathetic watching him throw the woman he betrayed me for under the bus to save his own skin. But the jury saw through it. My children attended the trial too, sitting behind me in the gallery, a united front. When Lauren was called to testify about how Vanessa had manipulated them, she wept openly, apologizing to me from the witness stand. "I failed my mother," she said, her voice breaking. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts for both Vanessa and Edmund, the courtroom erupted. Judge Whitmore scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, and in that time, several other women came forward with similar experiences with Vanessa. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Whitmore gave Vanessa Cole 18 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, legal malpractice, and racketeering. Edmund received 12 years as an accomplice. "You targeted vulnerable people, betrayed trust, and destroyed families for profit," Judge Whitmore said, his voice cold with contempt. Vanessa was also disbarred permanently, ordered to pay restitution to all her victims, and banned from practicing law ever again. And I felt nothing. Not joy, not satisfaction, just a quiet sense of closure. I moved back into my farmhouse on Sycamore Avenue in August. The house felt violated, like strangers had lived in my skin. I spent weeks scrubbing and redecorating, erasing every trace of Edmund and Vanessa's occupation. My children helped, bringing furniture and painting walls, trying to make up for their betrayal through service. But winning had left me with something unexpected: $3 million from my grandfather, $2 million in court-awarded damages, and all my original assets returned. I was 74 years old with over $5 million. That's when I remembered the other 11 women Marcus had identified, the victims of Vanessa's previous schemes. I tracked them down and called each one. "My name is Dorothy Brennan," I'd say. "Vanessa Cole destroyed my life too, but I got lucky. I want to help you do the same." 6 of them were interested. I hired Robert Kingsley to represent all 6 women pro bono. I paid his fees from my own pocket. Over the next year, we won 4 of the 6 cases, returning millions in stolen assets to women who'd been left destitute by Vanessa's schemes. For the 2 cases we lost, I personally paid the women's settlements from my own money. It wasn't about the money. It was about showing them that they mattered. In November 2024, I established the Dorothy Brennan Foundation for Victims of Legal Fraud. I seeded it with $2 million and recruited Robert Kingsley and Marcus Webb to the board. Within 6 months, we had an office in Louisville, 3 full-time attorneys, 2 investigators, and a hotline that received calls from across the country. We helped dozens of people, exposed 3 more corrupt attorneys, and got 2 judges removed from the bench for misconduct. My relationship with my children slowly mended. Lauren and I have Sunday dinners again. Michael calls every week from Arizona. Jessica visits often, bringing my grandchildren. They're trying, genuinely trying, to make amends. And I'm trying to forgive them completely. Today I'm 74 years old. I live in my farmhouse on Sycamore Avenue. I run the Dorothy Brennan Foundation, helping people who've been victimized by legal fraud. My life isn't perfect, I'm alone, and sometimes that loneliness aches. But I'm not broken. I'm a survivor, a fighter, and a woman who refused to disappear quietly. And this is how divine justice works, 78 years in the making, arriving exactly when I needed it most. They destroyed for profit. I rebuilt for purpose. And in the end, purpose outlasts profit, truth outlasts lies, and love outlasts everything. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.